From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
After threatening to strike Iran in retaliation for shooting down an unmanned U.S. drone, President Trump reportedly approved and then abruptly called off military strikes Thursday night as U.S. warplanes were already in the air ready to attack. We'll go to Tehran to get response from Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran who was part of the nuclear deal negotiations in 2015. We'll also speak with Professor Ervand Abrahamian, author of several books, including The Coup, 1953, the CIA and the Roots of Modern U.S.-Iran Relations. Then, Guatemala announces it will hold a recount of last Sunday's presidential and legislative elections amidst fraud allegations. We'll speak with Guatemala's former Attorney General, Thelma Aldana. She was considered a leading presidential candidate, but was barred from running. She was forced to flee Guatemala after receiving death threats.
Sufriendo venganza.
I'm suffering this vengeful harassment by the criminal structures of Guatemala because of the work that we did with the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. So what I hope now is for the country to give me the security conditions to make it possible for me to return to Guatemala. It would be very easy for them to take me into a prison and murder me.
Former Attorney General Thelma Aldana will talk about the elections and her time as Guatemala's top electoral prosecutor when she helped investigate hundreds of politicians and businessmen on corruption charges, including former President Otto Perez Molina, who was forced to resign in 2015 and is now in jail awaiting trial. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump reportedly approved, then abruptly called off military strikes targeting Iran Thursday night. The New York Times reports U.S. warplanes were already in the air ready to attack when Trump called the plan off. Trump initially okayed the strikes as retaliation for the downing of a U.S. drone by Iran Thursday. Iran maintains the drone had entered Iranian airspace, while the U.S. claims the drone was in international waters. Earlier on Thursday, Trump was asked about the incident.
Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
On Capitol Hill, Democratic lawmakers insisted President Trump must get approval before taking any military action. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke to the press after meeting with Trump.
I told the president that these conflicts have a way of escalating. The president may not intend to go to war here, but we're worried that he and the administration may bumble into a war. We told the room that the Democratic position is that congressional approval must be required before funding any conflict in Iran.
We'll have more on Iran after headlines. The Republican-led Senate voted Thursday to block the sale of billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Key backers of the bipartisan bill included Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democrat Bob Melendez, who spoke before the vote.
We've heard that these weapons are humanitarian weapons. But when they are used to precisely target civilians, how can we possibly continue to sell them? These are components of bombs that we know have killed thousands of civilians in Yemen, patients in hospitals, children on school buses.
The House is also expected to pass the bill, but President Trump has threatened to veto the legislation. In related news, a British court has ruled British arms sales to Saudi Arabia were unlawful because the government did not consider whether they would be used to commit, quote, serious violations of international humanitarian law, unquote. The court's decision came in a case brought by the Campaign Against Arms Trade, which cited Saudi Arabia's use of British arms in its devastating war against Yemen. Andrew Smith, a spokesperson for Campaign Against Arms Trade, celebrated the ruling.
What this ruling makes clear is that for far, far too long, the UK government has looked the other way as tens of thousands of people have been brutally killed in the most devastating humanitarian crisis in the world.
A federal court has ruled the Trump administration can go ahead with plans to strip federal funding known as Title X for Planned Parenthood and other clinics that refer patients for abortions or even mention abortion as an option. The so-called domestic gag rule could threaten health care for millions of women who rely on Title X health centers for primary and preventive care. Planned Parenthood President Dr. Lena Wen said, quote, "The Trump-Pence administration's gag rule is unethical, illegal, and harmful to public health," unquote. Meanwhile, in related news, Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo has signed a bill to expand the protection of abortion rights and abortion providers in Rhode Island. The Associated Press is reporting some 250 infants, children, and teenagers have been locked up for up to 27 days without adequate food, water, and sanitation at a Border Patrol station near El Paso, Texas. One local lawyer said a sick 2-year-old boy was being treated by 3 girls between the ages of 10 and 15 because no one else was helping him. Children have been reportedly fed uncooked frozen food or rice and have gone weeks without bathing or clean clothes. Attorney Holly Cooper said, quote, "In my 22 years of doing visits with children in detention, I have never heard of this level of inhumanity." This comes as the Trump administration argued this week in federal court that the government is not required to provide soap, toothbrushes, or beds to children detained at the border. Justice Department Attorney Sarah Fabian made this argument before a 3-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco Tuesday. All 3 judges repeatedly questioned the government's claim. This is Judge Wallace Tashima.
If you don't have a toothbrush, if you don't have soap, if you don't have a blanket, it's not safe and sanitary. Well, wouldn't everybody agree to that? Do you agree to that?
Well, I think there's fair reason to find that those things may be part of safe and sanitary.
Maybe are a part. What do you say maybe? You mean there are circumstances when a person doesn't need to have a toothbrush, toothpaste, and soap for days?
Well, I think in CBP custody, it's frequently intended to be much shorter term. So it may be that for a shorter term stay in CBP custody that some of those things may not be required.
Judge Marcia Berzon also pointed out detained children have been forced to sleep on cold cement floors with just an aluminum blanket.
You're really going to stand up and tell us that being able to sleep isn't a question of safe and sanitary conditions?
Your Honor, I think what I'd like to stand up and say is to focus the court on what the question is.
In other immigration news, a group of Japanese Americans who were once held in U.S. internment camps are planning to protest outside Fort Sill in Oklahoma Saturday. During World War II, the U.S. government imprisoned about 700 people of Japanese ancestry at the base. There were over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans imprisoned around the United States. Earlier this month, the Trump administration announced it would soon start holding migrant children at Fort Sill. Meanwhile, Colorado immigrant rights activist Jeanette Vizguera has been denied an application for a visa in her latest attempt to stay in the United States, where she's lived for almost a quarter of a century. Earlier this year, Jeanette Vizguera took sanctuary at the First Unitarian Society of Denver Church after her stay of deportation expired. She also spent 86 days in sanctuary at the church in 2017 before receiving her stay of deportation. She's the mother of 4 children, 3 of whom were born in the U.S. as American citizens. Visit DemocracyNow.org to see our interviews with Jeanette Vizguera. In other immigration news, a federal judge in Massachusetts has blocked federal authorities from making immigration arrests inside the state's courthouses. This comes 2 months after federal prosecutors charged a Massachusetts state judge and a former court officer with obstruction of justice for allegedly helping an undocumented immigrant evade ICE agents at a district courthouse in the city of Newton, Massachusetts. In news from Central America, Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez has ordered the deployment of at least 25,000 military forces across the country as protests grow demanding his resignation. Anger against the authoritarian Hernandez administration has been building for years, but recent unrest was triggered in April amidst news of government plans to privatize health care, pensions, and education. An Ecuadorian judge has ordered the release of Swedish programmer, data privacy activist Ola Bini after over 2 months in jail. But Bini remains under investigation for allegedly hacking the Ecuadorian government and has been barred from leaving Ecuador. Bini is a friend of WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange and was arrested in Quito the same day Assange was forcibly taken by British authorities from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he'd lived for almost 7 years. Ola Bini briefly spoke Thursday after the court hearing before being removed by authorities.
I'm not free. I'm out of prison tomorrow, but I'm not free as long as this illegitimate investigation is going on. As long as this illegal persecution is going on, I am not going to be free. But we will prove my innocence, and this will be over. And they're trying to censor me. They're trying to stop me from talking to the press.
British parliamentarian Mark Field has been suspended after he grabbed a female climate protester by the neck and shoved her. The incident occurred when dozens of Greenpeace demonstrators staged a protest at a speech by British Finance Minister Philip Hammond. Police are now investigating to determine whether Field should be charged with assault. In California, the war crimes trial for Navy SEALs Special Operations Chief Edward Gallagher took a surprise turn Thursday when a Navy SEAL medic testified he, not Gallagher, was ultimately responsible for killing a wounded captive ISIS teenager in Iraq. The medic, Corey Scott, claimed he asphyxiated the teenager after Gallagher stabbed the victim. Scott described it as a mercy killing. Gallagher is also charged with attempted murder for shooting an Iraqi schoolgirl and an elderly man. Firefighters in Philadelphia battled a massive fire overnight after a large explosion at a 150-year-old refinery in South Philadelphia. This marked the second time this month emergency responders were called to the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refining complex, which produces 335,000 barrels of crude oil every day. It's said to be the largest such complex on the U.S. eastern seaboard. No injuries were reported, but nearby neighborhoods were ordered to shelter in place. In health news, U.S. suicide rates have reached the highest level since World War II. The overall suicide rate has jumped by 33% since 1999. The crisis is most severe in Indigenous communities. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the suicide rate for Indigenous women has increased by 139%. For Indigenous men, it's up 71%. And 8 peace activists were arrested Thursday while protesting U.S. drone strikes after they blocked the entrance to the Hancock Air National Guard base near Syracuse, New York. The base is home to the Air National Guard's 174th Attack Wing, which helps run overseas drone operations. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with news that President Trump approved, then abruptly called off U.S. preparations for a military strike against Iran. The move came after the operation was already underway in its initial stages, with warships and planes already being put into position. The New York Times reports President Trump approved the strikes in retaliation for Iran shooting down an unmanned U.S. military surveillance drone with a surface-to-air missile, but then called off the attacks at the last minute last night. U.S. officials said targets would have included radars and missile batteries in Iran, and that strikes were scheduled for just before dawn this morning in order to minimize the risk to civilians and the Iranian military. It remains unclear if attacks on Iran might go ahead later. Iran says the U.S. drone it shot down was on a spy mission over Iranian airspace, but Washington says it was shot down over international airspace in the Strait of Hormuz. The Associated Press reports the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard's Aerospace Division says Iran had warned the drone several times before launching a missile at it. General Amir Ali Hajizadeh told Iranian state television on Friday, quote, "Unfortunately, they did not answer." Trump spoke to reporters about the downed drone Thursday in the Oval Office when he was meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Now, Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
How will you respond, Mr. President? How will you respond?
You'll find out.
Are you willing to go to war with Iran?
You'll find out. You'll find out. I mean, obviously, you know, we're not going to be talking too much about it. You're going to find out. They made a very big mistake.
Amidst tensions over the downing of the U.S. drone, the Federal Aviation Administration has now barred American aircraft from flying over Iranian-administered airspace in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Other airlines have also changed the routing of their planes. All of this comes after Trump pulled the United States out of the 2015 nuclear pact with Iran last year and has imposed economic sanctions on Iran. On Tuesday, the U.S. announced it was sending 1,000 more troops to the region. In May, it also announced a 1,500 troop increase after attacks on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Iran has denied being involved in the attacks and has repeatedly said it's not seeking war with the United States. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other top Trump officials have reportedly been linking Iran to al-Qaeda and the Taliban during closed-door briefings with congressional lawmakers in what Democrats fear could be part of a plan to invoke the 2001 authorization for the use of military force to attack Iran. For more, we're going to Tehran, Iran, where we're joined via Democracy Now! Video stream by Mohammad Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. He was part of the nuclear deal negotiations in 2015. Here in New York, we're joined by Ervand Abrahamian. He is a retired professor of history at City University of New York. He's the author of several books, including The Coup, 1953, the CIA and the Roots of Modern U.S.-Iran Relations. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's start in Tehran with Professor Mohammad Marandi. Can you talk about the response on the ground to hearing this New York Times report, which the Trump administration has not denied, and other now news outlets have confirmed, that they were in the midst of a strike right before the attack happened with the planes in the air? They called it off.
Well, people are viewing the whole story with a significant amount of skepticism. And the reason is that the whole affair, this whole saga began with the U.S. leaving the nuclear deal, and then subsequently Trump imposing economic warfare against Iranians, something which he said specifically, also said that these were brutal sanctions. So the escalation began on the American side. And then the tankers that were struck also were suspicious to the Iranians, because the tankers that were struck a month ago off the coast of the United Arab Emirates were attacked almost immediately after Bolton said the Israelis gave him information about an imminent Iranian attack, which made them suspicious. And then just recently, right off the Iranian coast, 2 other tankers were struck, linked to Japan. the tankers while the Japanese prime minister was in Tehran, the first prime minister from Japan in Tehran for 41 years. And right before he was supposed to meet the Iranian leader, these tankers were struck. And the Americans said they were mines. The company that owned the tankers said they were not mines. They were projectiles coming from the air. All of this makes everything that's going on over the past few days seem very suspicious in the eyes of ordinary Iranians. And with regards to this particular drone, this is not the first drone that belongs to the United States military that the Iranians have downed. They've downed a number of drones in the past. The United States never denied that. They've recovered the parts. And they brought down another drone by hacking the computer and landing it safely. And in this particular case, the Iranian foreign minister gave the precise details of where it was hit. And the Iranians also recovered parts of the drone itself. So the American government narrative here seems suspicious as well. And therefore, in the eyes of Iranians, everything that comes out of Washington right now has to be looked at with a great deal of skepticism.
Salami said Iran shot down the drone to send a clear message to the U.S. that Iran does not have any intention for war with any country, but we are ready for war. Can you explain the significance of his comments, Professor Morandi?
Well, when President Trump says that he can annihilate and destroy Iran in a tweet, then the Iranians are going to take any move by the U.S. military seriously. When the U.S. president and people in the White House constantly speak about all options are on the table and Republican senators calling for strikes on Iran, then that makes the Iranian military much more sensitive. The Iranians are already engaged in defensive actions against the United States. They have to constantly monitor American fighter jets, American ships that are constantly moving close to the Iranian border. And when a drone like this violates Iranian airspace, that basically means that they are looking for places to strike. That's how the Iranians interpret it. So the Iranian military had no option but to shoot down the drone. And the fact that the Americans don't want to wait to see the evidence in the UN Security Council also makes this more suspicious. So the Iranians have said repeatedly, we don't want war. That is why we remained within the framework of the nuclear deal. Even 1 year after the Americans have exited the deal and the Europeans are in clear violation because they are intimidated by Trump, and the deal is basically a one-sided deal, the Iranians are still abiding by the deal because they want to decrease tensions. If the Iranians wanted to increase tensions, they would have left the nuclear deal a year ago.
Ervan Ebrahimian, I want to bring you into this conversation. You're a historian. You wrote a book about the history of Iran. So you have, and you're from Iran, you know extensively what U.S. involvement with Iran is back to the U.S. overthrow of the democratically elected leader in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh. As you watch what's taking place now, and even if President Trump called off this attack that was supposedly about to take place Thursday night, it doesn't mean it is not imminent.
Exactly. I think the long-term agenda in the White House, maybe not Trump himself, but with Bolton, Pompeo, it's clear what their record is on Iran. They want basically the destruction of the Islamic Republic, maybe even destruction of the state, maybe even the destruction of Iran. So they have a long record on this. They haven't kept it hidden. And I think they were basically putting into practice, into implementation, this program. But of course, Trump has started basically his presidential campaign, and it's not good sense to go into an electoral campaign talking about war. So I think he has, as a presidential candidate, he has a vested interest in keeping the war issue basically as low as possible. I wouldn't be surprised that in a few days he comes up and says that he has a secret plan to resolve all the differences with Iran. He'll reveal the secret plan after the election. We've heard all these secret plans before. But whether he himself wants war or not, I don't think that's that important. The people driving policy, making policy, are in fact very determined to, from their point of view, solve the problem of Iran. And this new crisis, we can talk endlessly about the drones, the tankers. As you said, the recent crisis really starts with Trump saying that the nuclear deal was not just a bad deal, but it was the worst deal ever the United States has made, and that we need a new deal. Now, if he wanted a new deal, you usually leave a door open for negotiations for a new deal. But after he said that right away, Pompeo actually slammed the door. He came up with the 12 commandments to Iran, that Iran had to basically submit to 12 demands. Well, we know the 10 Lord's demands are quite hard to meet. These 12 demands are actually quite absurd. There's no way Iran could meet these 12 demands. I mean, it would be equivalent to the supreme leader in Iran telling Trump, oh, we were happy to meet and discuss with you, but you have to meet 12 demands. The first is you need to sit down and negotiate seriously with Black Lives Matter. If you do that, when we can discuss, or that, you know, your democracy is defective because very low percentage of the electorate votes. You have to do something about increasing your electorate participation, then we'll participate in negotiations. Well, these sort of demands would be considered absurd. Similarly, the demands that Pompeo put on Iran were absurd, as though they weren't really negotiating demands. They were basically saying, surrender, submit to everything we demand, and basically commit suicide. And this obviously is not acceptable to any regime that wants to survive. So from then on, basically, I would say some sort of military confrontation between U.S. and Iran was inevitable. Now, whether it happens next week or the week after or after the election, if Trump is elected, I think that's basically in the books. There's no way we can avoid basically some sort of military confrontation.
Mohammed Marandi, can you talk about the role of Jared Kushner in supposedly shaping a Middle East peace plan, and what does this have to do with Iran?
Well, I think one of the objectives of the Trump administration is to sideline Iran, to put so much pressure on Iran so that Iran discontinues its support for the Palestinian people. The Iranian position, of course, on Israel is that Israel, like apartheid South Africa, is an apartheid regime, and that it is morally illegitimate, and that it has to change fundamentally, like South Africa, until Iran recognizes such a state. In other words, Palestinians have to have equal rights and self-determination throughout the land. And but the United States, because of Iran's support for the Palestinian cause, wants to sideline Iran, to weaken Iran so much, or as the esteemed professor points out, perhaps even further. The United States wants to go further than that and destroy Iran. But they are doing this, or they want to do this, basically to strengthen the hand of the Israeli regime and allow them to finish off the whole issue of Palestine. Of course, I don't think that is possible. I don't think it's going to happen. The deal of the century, I think, is going to fail. But also, I'd like to point one other thing out, and that is, if indeed a military conflict is inevitable between the United States and Iran, I think there are two important things that have to be kept in mind. First, if there is a war, then, in my opinion, all of the oil and gas facilities, as well as the tankers in the Persian Gulf region, will be destroyed. This will not be just the issue of closing the Strait of Hormuz. This will be something very long-term, and that will lead to a global economic catastrophe, unlike anything we've seen in contemporary history. In addition to that, Iranian allies across the region will engage U.S. forces and U.S. allies militarily in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And then you would have the Saudi and Emirati regimes collapse immediately because they're completely dependent on oil. And millions of people will be on the move. So that's a scenario that is just something that people should not even contemplate. The second is that the United States may carry out a small strike. Here, I think, is almost equally dangerous because I think that there's some so-called Iran experts in the United States that are telling the U.S. government that if you carry out a limited strike, Iran will do nothing in response, or there'll be just some token response. That is a major miscalculation. The Iranians will be relentless in their response. They will probably be very disproportionate as well, and they will also strike those regional countries that would allow the Americans to attack. And the reason why the Iranians would respond so severely is that they want to make sure that the United States does not come to any conclusion that they could repeatedly attack Iran. And this, of course, could lead to further and further escalation. So it would be against the interests of the whole of the international community, as well as the people of the United States, to even contemplate any strike, even limited.
And Mohammad Marandi, we just have 20 seconds with you left in Tehran. The effects of the sanctions on the ground in Iran.
Well, the U.S. government is trying to make people suffer, and people have died. Certain medicines are not available. The U.S. government is trying to prevent Iran from importing medicine, among other things. And so sometimes some medicines are not available. And for people who have serious issues, they could die. And many people have died as a result over the past few months.
And finally, Ervand Ibrahimian, the U.S. media coverage, so often the media used to beat the drums for war, your analysis of it?
Well, I think I'm not an expert on the media, but New York Times so far has been actually much more cautious compared to in the Iraqi situation. I would imagine other press, Fox News and stuff, basically repeats the official line about Iran as being the cause of all the problems the U.S. has. But on the whole, I would say the quality press has been quite down to earth with it.
And of course, we will continue to cover this. Ervand Ibrahimian, retired professor at the City University of New York, speaking to us here in New York, and Mohammad Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, part of the nuclear deal negotiations in 2015, speaking to us from Iran. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Guatemalan elections. Stay with us. Now, St. Vincent. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Guatemala, where the Supreme Electoral Tribunal announced Thursday it will hold a recount amidst fraud and allegations following last Sunday's presidential and legislative elections. Former First Lady Sandra Torres of the party UNI currently leads the presidential race with nearly 26% of the vote. Before the recount was announced, a runoff was expected between Torres and Alejandro Giammattei, the candidate for the ultra-conservative Vamos. Both Both of them have been accused of money laundering and ties to drug traffickers. Guatemala's former Attorney General, Thelma Aldana, a leading presidential candidate, was barred from participating in the race and was forced to flee Guatemala after receiving death threats. During her time as Guatemala's top prosecutor, Thelma Aldana helped investigate hundreds of politicians and businessmen on corruption charges, including former President Otto Pérez Molina, who was forced to resign in 2015, is now in jail as he awaits trial. In March, shortly before Aldana announced her candidacy for president with the center-left political party Movimiento Semilla, she was barred from the race after criminal charges and an arrest warrant were issued against her. She says the accusations are retaliation for her work with Guatemala's anti-corruption movement. Last year, she was awarded the 2018 Right Livelihood Honorary Award. Well, I spoke with Thelma Aldana earlier this week, shortly after Guatemalans headed to the polls. I began by asking her about the outcome of the election.
In Guatemala, there is a captured state. This is something which I have verified with Ivan Velázquez, who was the commissioner of the International Commission Against Impunity and Corruption. In the investigations we carried out, we found out that there were illicit economic and political networks encrusted in the Guatemalan state. The institutions, particularly the institutions of justice or key institutions in the country that are part of the Guatemalan state, have been captured. In that context, the elections recently held in Guatemala lack any legitimacy. It is an election which has no possibility of being democratic because the state has been captured, and everything that emanates from dark institutions, institutions that lend themselves to manipulation, cannot yield a transparent process. I am referring to the Office of General Accounts, the Supreme Court of Justice, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, the Constitutional Court. All of these institutions have persons within who answer to the interests of any number of sectors, but not the national interest. I was a victim of those institutions, which for no reason, for no basis, left me outside of the election contest because I represented some disturbance to that corrupt and captured system, and I was a bother because I fought corruption. Now I am accused of facing absolutely false accusations, and I'm suffering death threats merely because I fought against corruption. I believe that in Guatemala, the conditions do not exist to be able to speak of a legitimate election.
Can you talk about who the Pacto de Corruptos is, what some call the corrupt wolf pack?
The Pact of the Corrupt or Corrupt Wolf Pack is a criminal and perverse alliance that has been operating in Guatemala for many years, especially through the old traditional politics whereby every 4 years we are made to choose among the same, and the people go to the polls with hopes that everything will change, and nothing changes. Because that criminal pact exists, that criminal alliance. This pact of the corrupt came about in particular of an action by the Congress of the Republic, which was legislating and indeed adopted laws that favored impunity and that favored themselves. The very legislators who were indicated by the CICIG, the International Commission, and the Attorney General's Office, they were accused of several anomalous acts. So there is alliance among several legislators in the National Congress, President Jimmy Morales, an important sector of the political class, and various interests who have all formed this corrupt wolf pack that has brought Guatemalan democracy to its knees at this time.
Thelma Aldana, do you believe they are responsible for driving you out of the country? Are they responsible, including the president, Jimmy Morales, for the death threats against you?
Ellos son los responsables de haber frenado el trabajo de la Comisión Internacional.
They are the ones who are responsible for having brought the work of the International Commission Against Impunity to a halt. They are responsible for having expelled Commissioner Ivan Velasquez. And of course, they are responsible for what I am experiencing at this time outside of Guatemala. They are responsible for having captured the Guatemalan state and having left me out of the electoral contest and favoring several sectors. They're also responsible for the whole manipulation and everything that was done in this election process. There are complaints in Guatemala that many people were brought to vote through illicit payments and any number of manipulative actions. These corrupt wolf pack.
El pacto de corruptos es el responsable, sin duda.
So can you describe who Sandra Torres is, the front runner in the presidential race and the runoff, as well as Alejandro Giammattei?
Yo conozco.
I know the history of Sandra Torres to some extent. I have met her perhaps personally, perhaps once. But we, the majority of Guatemalans, know that since she was First Lady, wife of former President Álvaro Colom, she exercised strong de facto power in the country. She had a clientelistic agenda, and according to one case that was brought by the International Commission Against Impunity, she has been involved in illegal campaign financing. But she's been protected by the Attorney General, by the Supreme Court of Justice, by the Constitutional Court, and also through her, several institutions of the state have been manipulated. It would be nefarious for the country for her to become the president of Guatemala, because her antecedents don't really speak of transparent work. Rather, there are indications that there's been corruption around her political movement and her activity in the government in Guatemala. Now, in terms of Mr. Giammattei, I don't know him. I just came to learn, because this was known nationally and internationally, that there was an incident involving extrajudicial executions in a prison of Guatemala, but he was acquitted of those charges. He is a person who has run for president of the Republic 4 times, I believe.
Aspirante a la presidencia de la República.
Once you were unfairly tossed out, barred from running, do you think the progressives in Guatemala made a mistake in not uniting behind Telma Cabrera, the indigenous presidential candidate who shocked many by coming in 4th? If the left and progressive parties had joined together, including you, once you were pushed out, might she have won the presidency or at least entered the runoff?
I think that the way to defeat the traditional politics, the old politics, and the pact of the corrupt in Guatemala was precisely to achieve unity of those parties with a progressive ideology. It was necessary for them to come together and to come to agreement on a single candidate. It could have been Telma Cabrera, could have been Mr. Villacorta, it could have been another progressive candidate not implicated in corruption cases and illegal campaign financing cases. It seems to me that it is unfortunate that the progressive sectors in Guatemala have been unable to unite. The problem in Guatemala is not of left or right. It is a problem of corruption and impunity, and around that struggle against corruption and impunity, several sectors, progressive sectors, right-wing sectors, transparent sectors, should have come together to struggle for a better country.
For our audience who is not familiar with Telma Cabrera, she ran for president with the leftist political party Movement for the Liberation of the People, known as the MLP. The party seeks to declare Guatemala a plurinational state to recognize its more than 20 indigenous and Afro-Guatemalan groups, wants to nationalize Guatemala's natural resources, and runs on a platform of inclusion and diversity. This is Telma Cabrera speaking to hundreds of supporters in Guatemala City's Constitutional Plaza for MLP's campaign closing right before the election.
Hemos sido gobernados por empresarios We have been governed by businessmen, military men, academics, and most recently by a comedian. We bring a struggle from within the social movements, from our territories, and we say, we are going to fight for progress of the Popular Constitutional Assembly in a plurinational state. It is urgent to create a plurinational state, to replace a failed state, a putrid state. We have to build a new state through the participation of the Mayan people, Garífunas, Xincas, and Mestizos.
So that's Thelma Cabrera, who came in fourth in the presidential race and did not make the runoff. But she got 11% of the vote, shocking many. I mean, she was the second indigenous woman to run for president. Rigoberta Menchú, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, ran. She didn't receive anything like this. Thelma Aldana, did it also surprise you, the level of support she got across the country, across Guatemala?
Yes, it did surprise me because Guatemala, unfortunately, is a patriarchal country where discrimination is constant, discrediting as well, and the political space is closed to women, particularly us women who act transparently and are progressive. All the more so, the political space is closed for an indigenous woman, a woman like Thelma Cabrera, who was trained as a leader in her community and who is fully familiar with the reality of the indigenous peoples, the reality of poverty, extreme poverty, lack of opportunity, and which has spurred migration. It spurred millions of Guatemalans to migrate, especially to the United States. So Thelma Cabrera today has emerged as a leader on the left who certainly will have quite a future in Guatemala.
Que sin duda va a tener mucho camino en Guatemala.
Thelma Aldana, would you have won if you had been allowed to run for presidency?
I think that right now I would have made it to the second round.
What do you believe Guatemala needs? If you had not been barred from running, what was your platform? And talk about the Movimiento Semilla, your party.
Yes, the Movimiento Semilla is a citizen platform, a progressive movement, ready and willing to fight poverty, hunger, extreme poverty that Guatemala experiences. We want to open up opportunities for indigenous peoples, for women, for the peasant population, for children, for youths, and we need to create that space for inclusion that is so badly needed in Guatemala. No doubt, had we participated, we'd be in the second round, and with a great number of a good possibility of reaching the presidency. And our most important goal was to rescue the Guatemalan state from the criminal structures that have it captured at this time, and to put in place a government at the service of the people.
Y generar un gobierno al servicio del pueblo.
Thelma Aldana, the former Attorney General of Guatemala, leader in the country's anti-corruption movement, former presidential candidate in this year's election until she was barred, now has fled the country facing death threats. Back with her in a minute.
Lecciones de un pueblo sin memoria que se toma las calles pero no lee historia. La verdadera guerra no ha terminado. Los que nos masacraron aún controlan el estado. A quien conviene el orden que se mantiene. Perdonen pero el optimismo ya no me sostiene. Hago lo que puedo pero no es suficiente. Aunque intento no entiendo al resto de la gente. ¿Qué más das? Igual no me entiendo a mí. Vivo en conflicto y no sé a dónde ir. Si no me hace reír, prefiero no seguir. Si no me vibra el corazón, prefiero huir. No encuentro la respuesta, no recuerdo la pregunta.
Guatemalan hip-hop artist Rebecca Lane. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our conversation with Thelma Aldana, the former Attorney General of Guatemala, leader in the country's anti-corruption movement, former presidential candidate who was barred from running in last Sunday's Guatemalan elections, fled the country facing death threats. In this exclusive interview, I asked her about the factors leading Guatemalans to flee the country for the U.S.-Mexico border in record numbers.
In
a country where 27% of the population is living in extreme poverty, that's 3.8 million Guatemalans who today don't have enough to eat. In a country where 60% of the population is living in poverty. In a country that is governed by a pact of the corrupt, where there is a criminal alliance. There are no opportunities, there is no security, and there are no opportunities for leading a life with dignity. And this forces people to migrate, to leave, to look for better living conditions in the United States. And the migration will never be brought to a halt until the underlying problem of Guatemala is resolved. And El Salvador and Honduras find themselves in the same situation. The problem is structural. The problem is one of lack of opportunity, discrimination, racism, and corruption. The rule for governing in Guatemala is corruption. That is not, it's no exception. They steal everything, and the people are left hungry.
What about the role of the United States? President Trump recently announced that he was cutting off all aid to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador because of the outflow of migrants into the United States. How will that affect Guatemala?
Guatemala
has had a lot of support from the international community, including the United States. The setting up of the International Commission Against Impunity, the CICIG, is an effort by the United Nations. Nonetheless, it is not appreciated in Guatemala. I think that beyond U.S. policy and beyond the support of the international community, which is extremely valuable, our problem is in Guatemala, and it needs to be resolved democratically in Guatemala.
So talk about what the CICIG did and what you did as Attorney General, as well as after, in working with CICIG. Talk about the threats faced by the investigators, who was held accountable for corruption, and what it means for CICIG to be ending in Guatemala right now.
In
my view, the establishment of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala is the best contribution that the United Nations has made to my country. It is the greatest effort, and it is a successful mechanism, a mechanism that does work. I can tell you that I worked hand in hand with the International Commission Against Impunity. It does work. And that is why the criminal alliance in Guatemala is bothered by this, and perhaps there might be some other countries that don't want a similar mechanism for the same reason. If a president of the republic, if a national congress sector is committed to transparency, if this is what we had, then they'd be supporting the work of the CICIG and the work of Commissioner Ivan Velasquez. During our joint effort, we were able to dismantle hundreds of criminal structures, and we showed the population the face of those who have directed the clandestine security apparatuses and those that have been in the Guatemalan state. We showed the Guatemalan population how these structures became illicit political and economic structures, and those are the ones that have captured the Guatemalan state. The cases that we investigated are a sample, a show of how we could make a contribution to the Guatemalan justice system in these conditions. We understand that a people with a solid justice system can think about democracy and can think about making progress in human rights and in serving the neediest persons. A justice system, if a justice system like that in Guatemala suffers backsliding, which is indeed what is happening, then at the end of the day, the people will pay the consequences. And the criminal alliance will continue with its status quo, with its illicit financing, and with worse living conditions in Guatemala.
So at this point, Thelma Aldana, what happens to you? You are outside of Guatemala, Can you talk about why and what your plans are for the future? What about these charges that have been brought against you of embezzlement and crimes around taxes? What do you say about them?
Y sufriendo venganza de las estructuras criminales de Guatemala.
I'm suffering this vengeful harassment by the criminal structures of Guatemala because of the work that we did with the International Commission against impunity in Guatemala. So what I hope now is for the country to give me the security conditions to make it possible for me to return to Guatemala. It would be very easy for them to take me into a prison and murder me because I've gone after gangs. I've gone after all kinds of crime in the country. And if I go back to the country, it's most likely that the next day I would show up dead.
Al día siguiente aparezco muerta.
Can you talk about the significance of the election of Lucrecia Hernandez Mack, the daughter of the murdered Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack, September 11th, 1990? Murdered by Guatemalan paramilitary forces, sadly backed by the United States.
Yes, Lucrecia Hernandez Mack and the 7 legislators who were elected by the Movimiento Semilla political party will no doubt be a light of hope in the National Congress. Lucrecia has done important work. She has brought a message of hope to Guatemalans. Nonetheless, I must recognize that they are a minority and that they're going to have to make a major effort to get their proposals adopted in the National Congress.
Se conviertan en una realidad en el Congreso de la República.
That was Telma Aldana, the former Attorney General of Guatemala, a leader in Guatemala's anti-corruption movement, former presidential candidate in this year's election until she was barred from running and left Guatemala facing death threats. At the end of the interview, she was speaking about Lucrecia Hernandez Mack, a newly elected legislator in the Guatemalan Congress with Aldana's political party. Although there will now be a recount for all of Guatemala's elections, Lucrecia Mack is the daughter of the renowned Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack, who was murdered by U.S.-backed Guatemalan security forces on another September 11th, 1990. We got in touch with Lucrecia Hernandez Mack in Guatemala City earlier this week, and I asked her about her mother's legacy.
In Guatemala, we had a 36-year armed internal conflict between 1960 and 1996, which was the year that we signed our last and final peace accord. During these years of conflict, the military would come into the rural communities and massacre them. So we would have a lot of survivors fleeing into the mountains and going as refugees to Mexico. And my mother, as a social anthropologist, would do research on the internally displaced population. So she would publish, along with certain U.S. universities. And because of these publications she did, she became an enemy of the state. So she was a target of an intelligence operation of the Estado Mayor Presidencial, which is the major office for the security of the president, and that worked as an intelligence squad, death squad. So in 1990, in September 11 of 1990, she was murdered, stabbed 27 times. Just when she was coming out of her work. After that, my aunt, Helen Mack, started looking for justice. She was able to prosecute and have a sentence against one of the material authors and one of the intellectual authors. They were both part of the military, and the intellectual author was a colonel who is currently has escaped justice. He was prosecuted, he was sentenced, but he was never, we were never able to put him in prison. My mother was the victim of a state that would repress and generate death. And many of us are just trying to convert and change that government into a government that gives well-being and life and health, basically. So that's maybe the major reason why I gone into politics, and now I'm an elected congresswoman. And I'm in a political party that is trying to, combine ethics with politics and to have a government that is not working for the military or for the oppression or for the corrupt, but finally will start working for the people.
Lucrecia Hernandez-Mack, former Minister of Health in Guatemala, now newly elected legislator in the Guatemalan Congress with the political party Movimiento Semilla, the political party of Telma Andana. The Guatemalan Supreme Electoral Tribunal announced Thursday it will hold a recount amidst fraud allegations following last Sunday's presidential and legislative elections. Well, that does it for our show. Very special thanks to Maria Taracena, Libby Rainey, and Charlie Roberts. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Nadura, Tamery Astudio. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.